Well, I've never monitored a DB server, and I've been curious about it when we talked about topics because that's something we've never had presented here. And I wonder what percentage of web developers have ever used equipment like that. I've had problems once or twice with it, and I think learning a little bit about that, even if you don't need it right now, this is something you'll be able to refer to. Charlie has everything online, so you can go back and you don't have to take notes. I'm
No.
sure we'll have the presentation up, and of course, it'll be on our YouTube site as well.
Yep.
So take it away, Charlie.
Cool, man. Thank you, sir. And to all of you, greetings again for those who weren't there earlier, and glad to be back. It has been a little while, but I've attended a couple of your sessions over the time recently, and great to see you guys still going strong. So yeah, this talk is one that I actually gave a few years ago, and when Rick was expressing interest in having me come and talk, I showed him a list of my presentations, said, feel free to pick anything you liked, and he thought this would be one that some people might like. So as it says, what if no one is monitoring your database server? And there's my contact information by email, all of the social media. I'm always just Arehart, real easy to find. Clicking a button and nothing would happen. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So have you ever had a problem with your CF app that was database related? And it seems a silly question, right? Because of course, everybody's had some problem at some point that was a database related problem. But where I'm going is, did you really understand the problem? Do you have tools that can help you understand that problem? Did CF get blamed unfairly for the problem? Like it wasn't CF's problem. CF was the victim of a database problem. Or was somehow CF fairly accused of the problem? And that does happen sometimes where some people contend that something about CF is causing trouble with their database, but really it's usually the other way around. And then another thing that people often encounter is they'll find that they have some problem that's a database problem in CF, but they try to recreate it directly in the database and they can't, like depending on what database you use. And I'll talk about different ones in this talk. But if you, let's say you use SQL Server and you run the query in Management Studio and it's fast and you run it in the CF app and it's slow, what's going on there? Well, again, those are all interesting challenges. Or there might be a problem where it's sometimes fast and sometimes slow in the same CF app, the same CF query. How could it be that the same query is sometimes fast and sometimes slow? Well, I'm just here to tell you that there are usually good reasons why that happens. But if you just look through the little pinhole of what does Cold Fusion say, you have no idea what the problem is. And so if you could be looking elsewhere, you might find the answer elsewhere. So this talk is going to talk briefly, before we get started about the database stuff, just briefly talk about, I hope you do have at least some CF or Lucy-oriented monitoring tools, because knowing whether the problem is even happening in Cold Fusion is important enough. And then do the tools, if you have them, and if they're capable, do the tools clearly say, yes, the reason a request is slow is because of a database problem. Some tools will tell you, some tools will not. So we'll talk briefly about that. And then I just want to also talk briefly, not the focus of the talk, but just briefly, what are some of the factors that can influence problems in a database? And some of them might surprise you, because I think, I do this stuff with people every day, and I think there's a handful of things that people tend to think, well, that's probably the reason why there's a problem. And then I'll show you these other things, and they'll go, oh, never thought about those things. Now, again, some people are experienced and you've already looked into these things, but I'm just going to throw them out because you want to be aware of them. That's my point. And then we'll move on to considering monitoring tools for the database. And I'll focus mostly on common databases, and I'll mention also some other ones towards the end. All right, so that's that. That's what we're going to talk about. As far as myself, some of you know this, I just focus on CF server troubleshooting. When I say CF in that sense, I mean CF or Lucy. And I'm an independent consultant, don't work for anybody, just work for myself. And I just help people in all sizes of organizations and all experience levels. I see just every kind of variation you might expect could exist. And all the work's remote, so it's safe and secure through shared desktop, Zoom, Teams, Meet, whatever you like to use. And I solve most problems really quickly, less than an hour, and I try to teach you how to go about solving it as we go. So that's the way I work. It's not everybody's cup of tea, and therefore I say, hey, satisfaction is guaranteed. If you don't find the time spent with me valuable, you won't pay for that time. So that's it. Bring me your problems. If I can solve them, great. If I can't, you don't have to pay for it. And you can find more about my rates and my approach and my online calendar and everything at my website, which is just simply arehart.org/consulting. And to be clear, I'm not selling anything, not even my services in this session. I just mentioned that is because people sometimes go, hey, we see you talk all the time. What do you do for a living? That's what I do for a living. So I'm just sharing my experience and that of others that I've learned from or learned with or whatever. And then finally, as Rick mentioned, I put my presentations online. This one is already online. If one of you wants to, any of you wants to right now, go get it, you can. I would argue think twice about getting it and getting distracted by looking ahead. You'll miss things I'm talking about. But the point is, everything you see, you'll be able to get it on the PDF that's already available right now. And when the recording's available, I'll post the recording as well. And then, yep, there's a nice little QR code for you to click on. I've been talking long enough. I think everybody who wanted to get it has already gotten it. So I'm going to go ahead and move on. So my first point, again, is let's talk about how do you know from within CF or Lucy whether you even have a database problem? Because you might think it is, and maybe something will tell you, no, it's not. And I just want to quickly say, from the simplest things to the more elaborate, what are your possibilities? Well, certainly the debugging output that you can enable in either CF or Lucy. You know that at the bottom of that debugging output, if you have it turned on, you can see how long queries ran. Sometimes that'll be your clue that there's a database problem. There's a slow, long-running query. And then some of you know that there's metrics that are logged or they're available through this command line CF stat tool, or if you use Windows, the perfmon tool, or if you use the Cold Fusion function called get metric data. Among the metrics that are reported are things related to database stuff, although I'll say those metrics are not very good. So I wouldn't make too much of understanding database problems from those. But again, they're better than nothing. If you have Fusion Reactor, I would argue that's just a great way to keep an eye on what's going on. It just does the job so well, better than any other thing that works on both CF and Lucy. And it's kept up to date and it's modern and there's new capabilities added all the time. And I'll momentarily, when we're doing some demos, I'll show you that. But that's, again, not the focus of the talk. I just want to point out that you want to have something that tells you what's going on in CF. I mean, literally, like what requests are running and how long have they been running and who did they come from and what query are they running right now? Fusion Reactor can tell you all that stuff. And the CF PMT, the Performance Monitoring Toolset, that's been available in CF since 2018, that can also give you that insight. Doesn't work on Lucy, of course, and it doesn't work if you're on earlier than 2018. But if you're on 2018, 2021, 2023, the PMT is another way to go. It's a different architecture and a different style of installing and configuring, and some people get tripped up by that. But anyway, either one would be great. Then if you are Lucy, there's the performance analyzer that Zach created, and it's got insight into slow queries and things like that. Again, it's not Fusion Reactor, it's not the PMT, but it's a nice subset of things, and it's, again, better than having no insight at all. And I would argue it's far better than those other things at the top for the most part. Again, there's pros and cons to all these tools, but I just want you to know some people that use Lucy don't even know that there is the performance analyzer. And also there's JMX tools, Java tools. And those Java tools may be based on JMX or not. I want to say that because some people, when they look into Java monitoring tools, they immediately jump into JMX-oriented tools. And I'll just say that again, metrics like that, like those metrics up above, sometimes they don't really give you clear insight into what's going on. And sadly, a lot of Java tools that are built into the JVM and stuff, they really don't give you insight into requests that are running and how long the requests are running. They're all focused on threads and stuff that's really hard to connect the dots into what's going on in CF, but it's not impossible. And I'm saying it's better to have that than nothing. And then, of course, APMs, application performance monitoring toolkits like New Relic and Datadog and AppDynamics and on and on and on. Those can also be great, and some are either free or they offer free plans, or they're commercial, but they might be worth it. But anyway, the point is there are tools that could, again, give you insight. For example, they could tell you they monitor database calls out of whatever Java application server you're looking at, whether it's Cold Fusion or Lucy or Tomcat or WebSphere, WebLogic, whatever. Anyway, so they're certainly worth looking at. And I just want to make that point is that you should at least have some tool that tells you what's going on inside of CF or Lucy, because it might give you a clue as to whether you should even turn your attention to the database. But let's say you do. So what are then some of the things that can affect database-oriented performance? And I just want to throw a few things out that you might hear about, you might not. You hear about blocking and deadlocking, and that's a whole subject about which we could have a whole talk of its own. But just be aware that depending on the database server that you use and its version, there are some default behaviors of some databases that are just prone to greater potential for one request to be blocking another, to be potentially even deadlocking with another. And there are capabilities in the databases that can be configured to change it. There's capabilities you can do in your code, although you generally shouldn't. There's capabilities you can do in the database. And so, we don't have time to get into that because I had that whole talk if I wanted to, but we're going to leave it be and just say that sometimes contention between requests that are running in the database that are manipulating data can block requests that are just wanting to look at that data, and vice versa. And that, again, is a little bigger subject. You could explore that on your own. And of course, indexing is certainly a potentially possible problem. If you don't have indexes and therefore the database is doing table scans, that would be bad. You can also have problems of over-indexing and creating too many indexes, which makes inserts and updates be slow, and deletes potentially. Anyway, we're going to move on and just say indexing is a potential source of trouble. Here's one that folks don't often think about: statistics. Most of the database engines, under the covers, they use statistics to sample the data in a given table and the columns in a given, the values of values in a given column, to try to determine, hey, can I estimate what will be the fastest way to get to this data? And those statistics are by and large done automatically, but there are means by which in some databases, if you're not careful, they may be way out of date and terribly poorly representing your data. And I've literally helped people solve problems that was some terribly slow request quote from CF, but it was really just a query, and it was slow in the database engine directly too. And I looked at some things and I said, hey, I think let's just look at your statistics for that index or the statistics for that table. And there's ways and different tools to look at that for different databases. And we just, hey, this statistics had been updated in 2 weeks or 2 months or 2 years. I've had some literally several years out of date statistics. Well, the database engine is making its decision on very old data. And sometimes there's just a checkbox you click to tell it to update the statistics. And statistics are done by sampling. So you could have a 1 million record database or a 1 billion record database, and updating statistics may not be that big of a deal because it's just sampling a percentage of the tables, and it doesn't even do all of them if it can avoid it. Anyway, the point is the database engine handles that. And some people would think, well, I thought the database just does it for me. I even got a checkbox that says, oh, auto update statistics, but you can look at the right tools and go, wait a minute, it's not up to date. So anyway, I'm just saying those could be a source of trouble. And that's worthy of a whole talk. And I've got a blog post. If you Google Arehart, my last name, and statistics, you'll come up with the first blog post where I have a book I point to, an online book, about 40 pages, that does a great job of introducing the issue of statistics. And then plan caching is how the database engine decides it can best look for your data, and it will sometimes keep that decision in memory, caching the plan of how to find your data. And that may be a good thing, but sometimes it may not be a good thing. And sometimes it may make trying to be smart and optimal, it'll make mistakes. So again, I've had blog posts and talks I've given in the past. So again, these are all topics about which we could have lots of discussion. That's not the point here. I just want you to be aware of those. Another big picture thing is just to be aware that if you've got transactional databases where people are inserting and updating records all the time, and you're trying to run queries at the same time against them to look over the past, weeks or months or years, that's kind of reporting oriented stuff going against a transactional database. They don't suit each other well. And so some people have for years talked about the benefit of creating like a duplicate of the database at some point in time and doing your reporting queries against that. Again, there's a whole subject about which a whole talk could happen. I just want to throw that out to say sometimes you're literally trying to shoehorn your CF app and it's giving people certain information into a database that's just not set up well for providing that kind of information. And you have choices of how to solve that problem, some of which we talked about, some of which we haven't. So anyway, moving on, some other factors that are less common. And you might think, well, I didn't hear about most of those. Well, let's keep going. I just want to put this out there for you to think about this. Sometimes when you're trying to solve a database problem, your focus is on my CF stuff or my Lucy stuff is slow. How can that be? I've even got Fusion Reactor watching. There's no other slow requests running. Why is my request running slow? Well, I just want to point out the queries then inserts, updates, is whatever they're running in the database, they may be coming from things other than your app in CF or Lucy. So they could be a .NET app or a PHP app or a Node app or a Go app, or it could be somebody with a desktop application. You never know. And so I'll talk later about the monitoring tools. One of the benefits is that they let you see what really is going on in the database and where are the queries really coming from. And they may be surprises to you. Another thing is that there may be processes in the database that are running that are not really requests, but might be hampering you. And they could be backups or index updates or all sorts of things. So just be aware, sometimes your slowness in a moment is being impacted by some background task that somebody either ran or some back automated process scheduled to run. And again, databases by and large have gotten smarter and smarter over the years to try to avoid impacts of things like this. But people do stuff. I'm just saying, you could think, why is my thing slow? And it's because somebody's doing something that you weren't aware that they're doing at the same time on the database you're trying to query. And then, of course, other processes on the database machine, right? Whatever you're running, Linux, Windows, doesn't matter. SQL Server, MySQL, Postgres, doesn't matter. If on that same machine, somebody in the background's running an antivirus scan or a security scan or a sync job, I could just go on with more and more things. That's going to potentially impact CPU or memory or network bandwidth or disk I/O, and all those could contend with your database server. I'm just saying, keep your eyes open, your mind open, because people sometimes myopically think, oh, I got to look into my database's metrics about wait types, and it's like, wait, it's not the bigger picture. It's something else impacting what you think is the problem. Look beyond that. And then same thing, I should have just put that in there for discontention. But anyway, antivirus tools, networking issues impacting database resources. By the way, you could have your database stored on a SAN or a NAS, and that's sometimes a surprising negative impact, because the SAN and NAS people say they're perfect, but maybe there's a network contention issue between the database server and the NAS or the SAN where the database data lives. So that's going to make your queries be slow. SAN's perfect, but the network isn't. So anyway, just beware. And I was saying there may be logging going on, and logging may be also contributing to large network I/O. Just threw that in as an example. Lastly, I just want to say, beware. I've helped so many people over the years solve whatever problems, CF, Lucy, database or not, where we tried and tried and tried, perhaps over an hour or two, using good tools. It's very easy within an hour or two to rule out things, because you can just look for certain evidences, and it's like, there's no reason that this should be performing so poorly. What the heck is going on? And I just want to throw out, sometimes either Cold Fusion or Lucy, or we're talking about databases, could be on a VM. VMs are wonderful, right? Well, sometimes VMs can be on what could be called an oversubscribed host. Something's got to host that VM. You in the VM just think you got whatever OS you're running, but you're in a VM and you're on a host with lots of other VMs. And it's kind of like this, story at the airport. You show up at the airport and you've got a ticket, and they say, sorry, we can't let you on. The plane is overbooked, and we've got to ask for people to get off. And they might say, I don't want to get off. And then you're stuck. You can't go because nobody's getting off the plane. Well, that can happen with VMs. And I just want to throw that out there. Again, I'm just saying, before we look into the tools that study what's going on in the database, they may not tell you why the problem's happening. They'll just confirm that there's a problem happening. I wanted you to have these thoughts in your head, either now or in the future. Just consider there's other things that you might not have fathomed that could be why there's a problem going on in your database. Now, before I move on to this last part about considering the tools, anybody want to jump in with any questions or comments? I didn't have the chat open. I see there's chat now. There you go. Oh, not related to this. Although, yeah, I'll just comment at John Farrar. Hey, John, pointed out that, yeah, back in the day, Ben Forder would often point out how databases were typically the most common bottleneck in web performance. And I remember him saying that. And I often, I agreed that often that is the case. I can also say from now my years of working with it, sometimes it's not at all the case, but yes, it can be the case. And I know you brought that up probably early in the talk. And again, thanks for pointing it out, because it's a good thing. It's a common refrain, good thing to keep in your head. Absolutely. If there's nobody else, I don't know if I can see if people are typing. I'll go ahead and proceed. So back to considering such tools. Those factors we just talked about just stress the need for having some tools that watch what's going on within the database. And I'll just say that even among the various tools I'm going to show you, their capabilities vary widely. Just like with CF tools, I showed you that list partly also to say, you all who work with CF, you know that range of tools I showed. You might have said, I would never rely on data debugging because we don't even turn that on, or I wouldn't rely on the metrics because it was always very paltry. Well, those lead to similar debates people have about various database monitoring tools. So I'm going to show you a range of them, and some will be very simplistic and some will be very capable, and most are in the middle. And you got to decide for your need and your database and your architecture and cost. And anyway, let's keep talking about that. So some will be more helpful than others. They really will. You'll be amazed if you don't have any and you see some, you'll go, oh my gosh, I can't believe I lived without this tool that told me this stuff. And then others are going to be, at least they're better than nothing. And I said that a couple times about the CF oriented stuff. Some things are better than nothing. Just make do with it. It's better than having no insight into what's going on. And then there's other factors that can influence it, or like your architectural complexity, the cost of the tools, if there's any. Some are money and some are free. Here's a big one. Do you have a DBA? And you might think we do, and therefore I can rely on them. But I'll tell you the converse is I find a lot of CF and Lucy shops, the DBA that's responsible often does not understand the nature of web-based requests sending volume into the database. They were trained and raised to be DBAs and maybe never had impact from a web application server that might be sending in thousands of queries per second. And I'm not kidding. Just a reasonable, simple web application, when you have good tools, especially like Fusion Raptor, you can see readily how many queries per second are happening. And I see sometimes that people sometimes do like 100, 200 queries in a given request. And if you're doing 5 requests per second at 200 queries per request, that's 1,000 queries per second. And when I say query, I mean anything, insert, update, delete, select, store procedure call, doesn't matter. Point is, 1,000 queries per second. Some DBAs are like, wait, what? Nobody showed me that. How do I? And my point is, they don't think about the implications of that in the problems they're trying to solve. They have their own, binoculars that they're using to look at the things they're used to looking at. And those things may not reflect the negative impact of thousands of queries per second, or the deadlocking that can arise because of that, for example, and just on and on and on. Again, you just weave all these thoughts together and you can see how sometimes a DBA may not really be helpful. In fact, they may be contentious because they're arguing that by their observation of metrics, is that Cold Fusion thing or is that Lucy thing? And we can maybe show them, no, it's something on your end. Let's try to work together. Let's stop pointing fingers. Don't blame it all on us. We won't blame it all on you. Let's come together. Another factor that can influence whether these tools will be helpful is whether your database is on-premise in your environment, or is it out in the cloud? Because if it's in the cloud, there are some tools that you have to install something on the server that runs the database. And you might say, I can't get to the cloud. It doesn't even let me. It's Aurora or RDS, if you know what those things are. And that's fine. There are tools that can work with that. Not all tools that do database monitoring need you to have anything more than the ability to connect to that database. And if you can, like, let's again say you're using MySQL and you run the MySQL Workbench or Navcat. If you can connect from a machine using whatever you like to use to look at your databases, well, it's possible you could install a monitoring tool on that same machine and with the right privileges be able to be doing monitoring of that database server from your machine. Doesn't matter where in the world the database server is, because some of these tools, all they need is a connection with the right authority to be able to look at diagnostics and metrics, and they will pull that information into your local copy of the database monitoring tool. And of course, you could put that on a web app and other people in your organization could be looking at it across the web. And so again, there's various options I'm going to show you today. And that was my last point there, is that some tools just don't require you to install anything on the database server. So don't let that be the reason you go, I can't do any of these tools. No. I get it. Some of these won't work for you, but some of them will. So let's move on. So what might database monitoring tell you? Well, they'll often tell you what's going on the database server, the DBMS, database management system, And literally the server, if you want to call it a server, I know some of them are serverless databases, let's not get into that, but some machine is running that database, and there's things about that machine, CPU and memory and disk and stuff that could be useful to know about. So some monitoring tools will give you that insight. Again, to bring it back to ColdFusion and Lucy, some of you know that Fusion Reactor on its web metrics page, one of the things is what's the total CPU on the box, and another place shows you what's the total memory on the box. It's helpful to know that and to not just look at ColdFusion. Well, the same thing's true when it comes to database monitoring. Sometimes you really do want to have some insight into, hey, is there like 100% CPU on the box and my database server is only using 50 of it or 40 of it? What's the other 40 or 50%? What the heck is going on? And that's where some tools will give you that insight. Other tools will at least tell you that's where the problem is. You got to get a tool that tells you what's going on out there. More valuable is when some tool can tell you whether and how long some database requests are running. And you might go, doesn't every tool tell you that? No, pretty much no tools tell you that. It's very infrequent that database monitoring tools will give you what I would argue is the most fundamental thing I want to know is, are there any queries running right now that are long? And let me tell you why. If you're looking into a CF application, or Lucy, again, if I say CF, I mean both, and there's a long-running request or a bunch of long-running requests, and with a good monitoring tool, you go, yeah, and it's all waiting to talk to the database. Well, then you want to look at the database and say, are there such long-running queries in the database? Yes or no? Because if there are, then that's where the problem is, and it's got to be solved. If somehow there's not, then it would suggest there's a network problem because Fusion Reactor or PMT or whatever tool is saying, or even the debugging in CF says, hey, this query took 10 seconds to run, and you were watching the whole time, and you never saw any query take 10 seconds in the database, then it must have been time spent between CF or Lucy in the database. So I'm just saying, if a tool that's a monitoring tool for the database could tell you in a moment whether and how long things have been running, that could be really valuable. And it's shocking how many tools don't tell you that simple piece of information. Or are there other requests running? Like at the same time, you're looking for the ones that you're focused on. If you could see there's other ones running at the same time, you'd go, oh, we're kind of piled up behind them. That there's this other thing coming from whatever. It may not be something in your app. It could be something else having nothing to do with your app, but you're contending with them. Well, a good tool that shows you what's running, that'd be trivial. I mean, when I get people to have these tools and that's their problem, and we can just solve the problem so quickly. The harder part sometimes is why the database requests are running slow. So if you have a monitoring tool that says, yes, here's slow running queries, the next question is, does the tool tell you why? And some tools will. They'll show you what's called the execution plan, or they might show you where time's being spent. Is it CPU or disk or whatever? So different tools have different capabilities. I'm just saying that's a bit more of a harder nut to crack. A lot of tools won't give you the insight into why they're running slow. They'll just tell you if they are, and some of them won't even tell you that. Here's a different twist on that. Not what's going on now, what have been the slow queries. Some tools will do that. For example, some of you use MySQL. There's a MySQL slow query log. Boom, you enable that, and you got a log that says what queries were slow. That's certainly better than nothing. It's not live in real time, but you could look at, hey, when our CF requests were slow 10 minutes ago, does the MySQL slow query log say that there were slow queries? Sweet, there you go. And so happens that MySQL has that. SQL Server doesn't have that. Now it has other things. We'll get back to that in a moment. But the point is having some simple thing about what queries have run in the past can be really valuable. Or more specifically, what queries were running at a point in time. Again, that's a harder one to come up with. A lot of tools won't give you that. But it'd be cool to be able to say, hey, at 2 o'clock today, what queries were running? If you could have that, you might be able to connect the dot as, oh, that's why our requests were slow at that time, because at that time our queries were slow, right? So it's one thing to be able to look at things live. It's another thing to look at things historically. And even within that, there's just what's been slow, give me the list, or what was slow or what was running at a particular time. That's harder to come by. And then some monitoring tools will give you that lower level database resource usage details that could be valuable. Some of those are what a lot of people focus on, and they get lost in those low level details, but sometimes those can be valuable. I'm just trying to say there's this higher level stuff, which a lot of tools just don't offer you. So anyway, let's move on. I'm keeping an eye on the chat now. I'll be considering tools for each of MySQL and Maria. and Postgres and SQL Server and some others at the end. Let's get going. So first about MySQL and Maria. If you didn't know, MariaDB is an implementation that's very similar to MySQL. And let's just talk about the simplest thing you could do. At the command line or in a query, you could write a CF query that does this. You could say show process list or show full process list, and that shows you what queries are running right now and gives you various columns of information, and you can make sense of that. Then I mentioned there's the slow query log. And by the way, I want to throw out that in honoring the time we have, I'm not going to be doing demos of everything. And some things I wanted to demo, and I had technical difficulties that are making it not possible, but let's not too worry too much about that. I hope that both what I've said so far and what we're going to cover will still be valuable. And remember, all this, the PDFs, you'll have it. So you'll be able to just look these things up when you're ready to look them up. Now, one of the challenges with the slow query log is finding what's the name of the file and whether it's even enabled. And so you can run the show global variables command. Again, you can do that in a CF query statement or query execute for those for script. Again, let's not quibble about that. Do whatever, pick your poison. What I'm saying is you can run a MySQL query, as it were, of show global variables like %slow. And there's command line tools and MySQL Workbench and other tools, Navicat, and on and on. Again, let's not get into that. The point is you should be able, you may find you can run this. Maybe you can't, you may not have the authority. Well, if you don't have the authority to do this, you don't have the authority to look at the logs. So again, I'm talking about if you have the ability to look at these things, how could you do it? And if you do this show of the global variables, you'll see things like what is the slow query log folder and path and name of the file, and is it enabled, and what number of seconds do queries have to exceed before they get logged, and on and on and on. And then you can, if you don't have access to the server, if you have some tools like MySQL Workbench, which is free from MySQL, that tool has in it a server logs interface where you can look at the logs. So check that out. And then included in MySQL's bin folder, which again won't help you if it's on a server that you can access or if it's serverless, get that. But for everybody else who can access their MySQL folder, in the bin folder, there's a MySQL dump slow Perl script that you could run that can give you insights into what's going on. And then I want to move on to this because some people don't know about it. This is built into MySQL. It's called the performance schema. It's a terrible name. It's like the performance database. It's a database with information about what's going on in your MySQL setup. And there's reports against it built into MySQL Workbench. So check that stuff out. I mean, so for some people, that may be the most valuable thing you hear. Now, I know others are going to go, come on, everybody knows that. Well, no, trust me. I work with people every day. They do not all know this. So I appreciate that some of you might think some of these things are, come on, these are trivial. Everybody knows it. No, they really don't. And that's why I'm throwing them out there so you know. Before we move off of the built-in tools, let me just point out, some of you may know this. If you have the Enterprise edition of MySQL, there is a MySQL Enterprise Monitor. It's a tool that's built in. You don't get to use it if you're on the Community Edition or the non-Enterprise editions, although that could change over time. But you definitely can't use it with the with the Community Edition. So anyway, check it out. If you got it, it's great. If you don't have it, you've got these more simplistic tools that are already built in. Now, what about third-party tools? Well, I don't have time to go over all of them, but let me just show you these handful of them, several to consider, and some of them might be ones you've never heard of. And I'm not saying that they're all going to be right for you, but I'll bet some of them will be wonderful for you, and others we go, I hate that. I don't want to use that. Well, check them out. That's my point, is look at them. And some of them are free and some of them are commercial. Now, before I look into any of the individual ones, let me point out at the bottom right corner, I've got, some of you know, I have a site called cf411.com, and on it, I have categories, and one of the categories is database monitoring tools. And so if you just go to cf401.com/dbmon, you get taken to the section of the page where I list the tools, and I tell you there the tools in alphabetical order and what databases they support. And I say whether they're free or commercial and some other characteristics, like when they were last updated, because sometimes they're old tools and I want to keep you informed. So anyway, if you check that out, you'll find these all there and listed as being for MySQL, and I'll have others later for the other databases. If I were to pick a couple out that I'd say some people would maybe find more intriguing than others, I want to point out that DB Marlin there, because that's a relatively new entrant in the field, been out for a few years. And they offer a free license that I think lets you look at 5 instances. I can't remember. I've got it in my website. I'll just say, go look at it. The point is, you can use that for free in production. And if you don't have anything, man, consider getting that, because it gives insight into what's going on the server and what queries are running and a lot of that stuff I've talked about. And that's one where I wanted to have a demo ready to go and I had some difficulty, so I can't show that. But anyway, just take my word for it. Check that out. And by the way, I'll repeat these lists for the other ones, and it works for MySQL, Maria, SQL Server, Postgres, and the cloud variants of them, because it's something, again, that you install on your machine and point it to your database. So I just think there's others here. I'm not saying that they aren't great. You might love any one of these other ones, but some of them, they're from companies that try to sell you on stuff, and some of them are from a perspective that I don't, think is the best way to go. I'm not saying anything's wrong with any of them. I'm just saying, be aware. Some of them are just too expensive, or they're old, or not very insightful. But I wanted to give you, there's choices. That's all I'm getting at. There's choices. And lastly, notice the second to last bullet point. Hey, if you use New Relic, Datadog, Nagios, PRTG, a lot of these monitoring tools for your infrastructure and network, they'll have plugins for a given database. And again, some of the plugins, they work by you add them to your setup for them, and you tell them how to reach into your database. So they can just reach into your database and get data. Others, you need to install something on the database server for it to work. And I'd explain that in some of them. I think, I don't want to say get it wrong, but if you look at my list, I tell you one of these, you have to install it on the server, and the other one you don't, between New Relic and Datadog. I can't remember which one's which. But anyway, let's move on. No more questions yet? Okay. All right. Now, I just mentioned things for MySQL and MariaDB. What if you are running Aurora or RDS, which are AWS cloud-based implementations of that, or Azure DB, which is Microsoft's cloud database for MySQL and Maria? Well, first of all, again, some of the tools I showed you, they'll work just fine on that. But I want to point out the ones, again, that are installed on a machine, not the ones that you have to install on the host. I realize you can't install stuff on the host. We're not talking about a VM where you're running something. We're talking about these cloud-based variants of database servers. But for example, AWS also offers specific monitoring of Aurora and RDS databases through these features they've got: the RDS console, CloudWatch, Performance Insights, DevOps Guru, to name a few. So I just want to point those out, because if you run one of these, Aurora or RDS, and you didn't know that, go check it out. It's a feature, and some they cost extra money, some don't. So anyway, I'll leave you to look into that. And then for Azure DB, again, some of the previous tools would work. And then sorry, I should have said Microsoft. Oh, my bad. Yeah, I messed up here. Let me just correct that before I forget, and then I'll get you guys, I'll get the updated presentation. I should have said Microsoft offers Azure DB. There you go. Via Azure Metrics, Azure Diagnostic Logs. And this is important. I want some of you to hear this in fact, let me back up. This. I'm going to talk later about SQL Server. And some of you have been using SQL Server a while, know that there's a thing called Query Store in SQL Server. I'm saying Query Store for MySQL and MariaDB? What? Yes. Azure DB, as Microsoft implements those database engines on their Azure DB cloud-based deployment, they are enabling the Query Store feature for MySQL. And if you know what the Query Store is for SQL Server and are appreciating how it's evolving, getting better all the time, they're bringing that to other database servers, not just SQL Server, which is really weird. But anyway, let's move on. And then they have a feature called Query Performance Insight that uses that Query Store. And sorry, I momentarily lost the chat. I'll make sure I can see that if anybody chimes in with anything. All right, here we go.
Well, Charlie, we'll let you know if somebody does chat.
Oh, cool. Thank you for that. Good deal. Appreciate it. All right, now back to, or on to Postgres. So you could use Postgres. It's a wonderful, another example of free, open source database, getting better all the time, advancing above MySQL in some ways, advancing above SQL Server in other ways. They don't currently have an equivalent of that show process list, which is curious because it throws a lot of people off when they get started moving, let's say, from MySQL to Postgres. But some of you know that they've got a PG stat activity database or view, and you can do a select whatever from PG stat activity and where whatever, like to see what requests are running right now. This is it. You do the select whatever star whatever from that where state is active, and you will be shown what queries are running. And I want to remind you, you can just plunk that into a CF query or query execute and run it anytime you want, as long as you as a user have permission to run such a thing. And I'll just throw this out, I forgot to mention it earlier. Even if your data source definition doesn't support the user that runs your data source in CF admin or Lucy admin, you've defined a user that doesn't have this authority, you can override that with a CF query with a username and password and run as whatever user you want to run as. Or there's also trusted authentication approaches, which again, I'm not going to get into now, but you don't have to always pass in a username and password to talk to a database. Moving on. Again, we're talking about Postgres built-in tools. And I don't know why I put this under built-in, because these aren't built-in. My bad. That was just a mistake again on my part. But anyway, let's move on. Open source tools, PG Activity, PG Admin, and PG Top. And I'll leave you to look into those if you're interested. Just Google. You'll find them readily. And I have links to them on my CF411 page, of course. As far as third-party tools, this may look like the same list, but it's actually not. It's different in some ways. And one thing that's distinctly different is the Redgate SQL Monitor. That works for Postgres, doesn't work for MySQL. But most of these other things did work for MySQL. So that's another benefit, is some of these, like DB Marlin right there, you learn one and it works with whatever database you work with. Some of these tools do work that way. And if you look at my list, I tell you for each tool what databases they support, and some of them support pretty much everything. So anyway, check that out. And don't forget if you're running Postgres in the cloud, there's Aurora and Azure DB Postgres, and everything I said applies to Postgres the way it applied to MySQL. Hope that makes sense. Now, moving on to SQL Server, what are built-in tools for SQL Server or for Azure SQL DB or RDS for SQL Server? So, of course, there's Management Studio, and some of you have been using it for a while. I actually happen to have that open right now. Let me just show that real quick, because I help people all the time using SQL Server, and they've been using it for years. And I say, let's look at Activity Monitor, and they're like, what's that? So just notice right here, I've got a couple servers selected, and whether it's a really old one like this, which is on SQL Server 10, is like 2008, or this one, which is 16, which is like 2019 or 2022. If you it doesn't matter whether it's an old one or new one. When you right click on the server name in the Object Explorer in the top left corner by default, you see Activity Monitor. Activity Monitor. And I've already got it open. It just opens as a tab. And here they are already open on a couple different servers I was looking at. And they present information. Now, this one is the one that's going to have the most kind of activity, although it doesn't. Let me just say, this Activity Monitor tool, when you open it, it's basically these different panes, graphs of pretty low level, metrics, a list of processes running on the server and their process ID and some other stuff that can be useful, but often is not. Then there's weights, which can be useful, but may not make sense to a lot of people. There's data file IO, which can be valuable, but may not be. What throws people a lot is they'll have seen this recent expensive queries and think, aha, that's going to show me what's been slow. And I'll just say, no, let me tell you real quick. No, that is on average what has been slow recently. And the second column here, when you mouse over it, it pops up and says, that's the recent execution rate for this query, whatever query it was. Like there's one from a real database. Here's one from a real database. There were 3 calls to that particular query. And if I mouse over that query, it pops up and show me the query. What I'm trying to say is that's not as useful as you'd think, because you could have something that's run many, many times and it's usually fast, and then 1 or 2 runs are slow. Well, the average isn't going to go up very much. So you'll see there's nothing that's slow on average. So anyway, that's what this column here is, average duration of all completed requests, and you could sort it by that. I'm just trying to say this is not very useful. And for years, that's all you had. This is an old SQL Server 2008. That was it. Well, now I'm going to switch to a newer SQL Server. And instead of just those lists, look, there's also now active expensive queries. Well, again, I just want to make a quick plug for if you use SQL Server and you want to see our queries running right now when there's bad stuff happening in SQL, in CF or Lucy, if you can hop into Management Studio and if you can right click on the server and choose Activity Monitor, it'll open up a tab. And in a moment, this will start to populate. And if there's long running queries, I know it says active expensive queries. This is just what queries are running right now in reverse descending order by duration. And the duration column is right here, elapsed time. And you can make these wider, of course. And if you make them wider, it'll remember it. But there's elapsed time. So if I just clicked on that, that would be now sorted. I don't have any running to make a point, but it's not important right now. The point is to know that that's there and that this isn't what some people think it is. It's literally what queries are running at a point in time. Now, how often is this being refreshed? We'll just want to tell you real quick. This top thing called overview, it's a very old interface. You know, this has been modified over the years. This is Management Studio 2019, Management Studio 19. There's a new one, 20, that just came out. But some of these things have not changed for years. This is sadly so unobvious. How would you know how often this is refreshing? Well, you have to know to right-click anywhere on this gray bar. You right-click, and there's refresh interval. And I said it's a 1 second. You can make it be as slow or fast as you want. The default's 10 seconds. Now, beware also that sometimes people will pause it. And if they click pause, it says the word pause, but you may not notice it. The graphs won't be updating. These lists will not be showing anything new on them, and that sometimes misleads people to think there's no problem, and they don't realize, oh, it's crap, it's paused. So you resume it, and now it's back to really producing stuff. Okay, so that was a quick little trip around Management Studio, because I just find that that's really valuable. And that active expensive queries has been there since SQL Server 2014. But if you didn't know, you wouldn't know. And there's some people in the community that are highly respected SQL people, and they don't even show tools like this because they go, oh, I use other tools that I think are better. And I'm not saying they're not better. I'm just saying this is right there. It's built in. It's usually better than nothing. So anyway, moving on. There's also reports. And again, I just want to point this out. When you're on that activity monitor, when you're on the server and you right click on a server, there's reports. So here was activity monitor. I'm not on a database. I'm not on a table. I'm on the server machine name itself. And where I could see the activity monitor, there's also reports. And in the reports, under standard reports, look, there's a performance dashboard, a server dashboard, configuration changes history, and then really performance stuff. What's currently blocking? What are the top sessions? What are top transactions by block transaction? I mean, all these things are just built in. Top queries by average IO or CPU, whatever. Just dig into it. Dig into it. Your environment may look different. They may prove very useful. I just want to say they're built in right there. So check it out. Okay. And then I mentioned early in passing that since SQL Server 2017, Microsoft has now included an optional thing called the Query Store. Now check this out, starting in SQL Server 2022, which we think these numbers sound so modern. That's 2 years ago. So SQL Server 2022 from 2 years ago, which you may not be moving to for 5 more years or 10 more years. But anyway, if and when you get to SQL Server 2022, if you've heard things about the Query Store and somebody, dissed it or said it didn't work well or didn't perform well, Microsoft has addressed those problems to the point that now in 2022, they're making it on by default. And it is, again, like a database. It's like the performance schema in MySQL. It's a database of performance information about everything going on in SQL Server. And it's very configurable, and it's got lots of stuff that I'll leave you to look into. There's tools. I'll mention in a moment some tools that you could get. Some of you may know that SQL Server also has this notion of DMVs or dynamic management views, and they can give you valuable information, among which is performance-oriented information. There's SQL Server Profiler, a tool that's been around for years, and some people say, oh, never use that. That's not true. If you use it carefully, you can even use it in production. You just got to know what you're doing. Be careful. Traces are a little more like, probably shouldn't be using those anymore. And then extended events, which are even more capable than DMVs. I'll just say you should look into those things. If you run SQL Server, these are the built-in features that you should learn about take the time to learn about them. I wish I could talk about them more. We don't have time to go into every one of these things. Now, moving on to the third-party tools, some of these are the same as before. Let's look at the first two. They weren't on that previous list. So first is Brent Ozars. If you're in SQL Server, you've probably heard of him. He offers a bunch of tools, and you should check out his tools. And he's got consulting. And some of his tools are just so capable and powerful that you just get the tools and implement them and use them and read his blog posts about how to use them and stuff, and you'll be amazed. And I realize as I'm speaking that I didn't list one that he uses all the time and Eric uses all the time, and I didn't think to mention it. It's called SP Who is Active. So let me just add that in real quick to add to this list. And it's an open source stored procedure called SP Who is Active. And I'm sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head the name of the gentleman who runs it. I should know it, but it's not coming to me at the moment. I didn't mean to do that. Oh. There you go. So yeah, look that up and I'll add that to my list. I don't know why I didn't have that, but it just came to me. Don't forget about that. Well, anyway, so Brent, and then Eric Darling Data, I believe is the domain. But if you just Google his name, you'll find it. It's Eric with a K. And both of them blog a lot. They speak at conferences a lot. They create tools that they share. They write about using the tools. That's all I'm trying to get at is they have lots of tools and resources. And Eric in particular has a few that I'd like to highlight, but I just knew I wouldn't have time to do everything I wanted to do. But look at his SP Quickie Store. That's for making better use of the query store. And then he's got one called SP Human Events, and that's for using those events, extended events, making them more useful. So again, just look into his website. You'll find their link to their tools, both of them. And they offer consulting. And I want to point that out because sometimes you just want to solve the problem and you just want to call somebody who you think will know what they're doing. They might be expensive. They may be hard to get immediately or whatever, but for the right price, they'll make themselves available immediately. Anyway, check them out. And I mentioned SP Who is Active, and that's basically just a simple, like not simple. It can be as simple as what queries are running right now, and yet it's got a lot more capability. I'll leave you to explore that. It can be very powerful. Then Database Health Monitor, or Database Health is the site, databasehealth.com. The guy behind it, his name is Steve Stedman. So he created the tool. He used to give it away. Now he has variations of it's mostly free or mostly commercial, but there's ways to get it for free. But it's, definitely worth it. It's the first of the tools I'm listing here as monitoring tools. They're in alphabetical order, but I want you to know about that. Definitely check it out. Because again, anything's better than nothing, and he offers a lot, even in the free version. So again, check that out. And then you see some of these other ones we've talked about before. Idera has a bunch of things for SQL Server that weren't on the previous lists, and they're ones that have evolved over the years from different tools that they've acquired and stuff like that. But check them out. They're just more of these that we've talked about before. And then SQL Sentry on the SolarWinds line. SolarWinds, the company, bought Sentry One, which included SQL Sentry, and so some of the tools that used to be separate are now under SolarWinds. So and check them out. I have them all on my list at cf401.com. One other one there is called SQL Grease, and that only works with SQL Server as far as I know. And it's another choice to consider. Just want to point that out. Sorry for the mess up down at the bottom. I'll sort that out too. Anyway, moving on. Azure, AWS or Microsoft's equivalent of Azure. Azure, some say, offers Azure SQL database, which is SQL Server in the cloud, and they offer monitoring. And their monitoring is through tools that they call Database Watcher, SQL Analytics, SQL Insights, and others. So again, I'm just pointing those things out because some of you could be working with Azure SQL DB, which is SQL Server in the cloud, and not know how to monitor it. And there's these tools that are either built in or readily available. Some are free, some are at cost. I'll leave you to explore that. Finally, as for other databases, rounding things out, there are for those other databases, some of these third-party tools that will work for Oracle or the RDS implementation of Oracle in the cloud, DB2, my IBM's database. For NoSQL DBs like Mongo and Redis, there's tools. Some of these tools that I talked about work with them. There's other tools that work with them. we'll just say explore those things. Literally, some of the tools I've mentioned today, you'll see they support even all these and more than I'm not naming. So I'm sure there's probably something I didn't think of that might be somebody's particular situation, but this is about where I wanted to end it. So let me, just write it about an hour. Again, see that site I've got that has more on tools, and I tell you every database that I've found that they support. So in conclusion, obviously I mentioned a lot of tools. Many of them are free. Some of them are commercial, but they're worth the cost. Some of them, they're not worth the cost, and they're just expensive. And I'm just saying, don't grab the first tool that somebody recommends. Consider these options. Some of them are simple enough to just remember the ones that you can implement on your own machine and point to your database. Just try some. No one would even know you're doing it because you're just pointing your tool at the server like you'd point your Management Studio or MySQL Workbench or Navicat or whatever you like to use. You're just pointing a monitoring tool at the server to pull down monitoring metrics. And they tend to be lightweight and not impactful. And if they were, somebody would tell you, or the tool would tell you that there's a negative impact all of a sudden, or your Fusion Reactor or PMT or Lucy Performance Analyzer will tell you, hey, your queries have suddenly gotten slow. Then you might want to blame the database monitor. But in my experience, they don't cause such trouble. And that's a point I really want to make sure you hear. And then don't forget, start with CF tools that monitor what's going inside of CF, because sometimes people are focused on trying to solve a problem with the database. And if you looked at the right place, you'd find out, hey, no, there's no database problem at all. The problem is with something else that's happening. Now, I have lost the Teams view. But I'm assuming you guys would have told me. There you go. Yeah, there you are. Good. Somehow that disappeared on me. I wanted to be able to see again if there's anything coming up. So start with CF tools. That's why I started with that. Is there a CF problem? Is it a Lucy problem? Is it a database problem? Maybe, maybe not. And then, of course, beyond the tools that help you identify the problems, I know that solving them is going to take different effort, more effort. The tools may or may not help. You may need help with that. I've mentioned some consultants. There's others. By the way, Percona, I forgot to mention that. The company Percona that makes one of the tools, the Percona monitoring and management tool, PMM. Percona is well known in the MySQL and Postgres world for offering consulting. So again, you don't have to go these things alone. You don't have to rely on Stack Overflow and Slack and your friendly, neighbors to help you solve problems. If there's a reason that it would make sense to bring in a consultant, they're out there and available. I listed some of them. And then I'm also available to help with database problems and CF and Lucy problems. Just let me know. If I can't help, I'll point you to others. If you want help from others, I'll point you to others. So anyway, let's open the floor now to questions. Just in under an hour. Woo.
Well, I will say, Charlie, I've been doing this for 25 plus years, and some of these tools I was familiar with or had heard about, but an awful lot of it was stuff I wasn't aware of.
There you go. And if you use the databases, then I hope it helps make you more effective to go pursuing problems.
All right.
That's what I'm all about. Make you more capable.
Okay, Randy just asked a question about Apex.
That's right, Randy. Good point. I used to talk about Apex too. I'm sorry. That it's not only weird that I don't have it in the presentation, but I'm realizing I don't have it in my website, and I just want to take a quick look. You may already know the answer, but I was wondering, could it be possible that it no longer exists? Sometimes these tools do go the way of the Dodo bird. Nope, it's still there. My bad, Apex people. So I'll definitely get that added to my list, and let's just take a quick look and see what it supports. So it looks like they have a fundamentals toolkit. So that's interesting. Randy, it's been a while since I've looked at them. Is the monitoring different than these fundamentals toolkits? I would believe it would be. So I'm trying to find out. Oh, I see. There you go. Oh, wait a minute. Maybe that's our answer. Hold on. I'm mousing over solutions. There's operations toolkit for managing SQL Server. There's compare and sync. There's DevOps. There's fundamentals for simplifying and automating routine tasks. Yeah, it doesn't look like they have a monitor anymore. So I'm going to turn my attention back to the chat to see if you've said anything. You still use it? Oh, bummer, he's in the car. Well, so I don't know if you can see our screen, but we're looking at their website, and I'm not finding anything that's listed as a monitor. And I remember it used to. Now, I will point something out. I noticed at the top left corner, it says Apex SQL by Quest. Quest is another one of those companies that acquires lots of tools, and it could be that they acquired it and folded it into something that they now call something else, but you who still have it can still use it. That's possible. But if you knew, feel free to say so. And if anybody knows, speak up. And if anybody learns anything they want to share with me, again, in the bottom right corner of all the slides of my presentation, I've got my email or my social media at Arehart, and my email was on the front page. It's charlie@arehart.org. Easy to find if you look for me. Can't remember where it is. Yeah. Is there anybody else?
That's exceedingly common with companies. I just did a query today where I was looking for something, whatever happened to it, it got bought, and it's still there. It's just they gave it like this stupid name, like 7 words or something like that, whereas it was 1 word before, and I guess that's how they do things. You know,
right, because it's probably part of a big suite of many tools, and they have to name in many words what the tool's for, who's it for, and in doing that, the cool simple name has to go away. Yeah. Oh, here's something else. Nick, one thing he'd mentioned too is also check connectors or JDBC versions as well. There have been a string of bad MySQL drivers that I've seen cause database slowness. Excellent point, Nick. That's very, very good point. I should have thought to add that. Thank you for making that point. So one thing is that people that use CF, for example, tend to just use whatever driver comes with CF. But certainly if there's a problem, they may struggle to find a solution to it. And that might lead them to find another one. I will say that of the built-in CF drivers, those are licensed from a company that used to be called Data Direct, and they got bought, and it's Progress, and they're the Progress drivers for SQL Server and other stuff. Well, it so happens, I'm just going to say this because it goes to Nick's point, some of you may know that Adobe does not provide any driver for MySQL or Postgres. That's up to you to go get. So somebody who wants to implement CF talking to MySQL Community Edition, I should say the Community Edition, you have to do this. If you have the paid edition, there is a driver, but the free edition, they couldn't arrange the licensing of that in a way that made sense cost effectively. So they just tell you, you go get your own driver. Well, absolutely. Sometimes when people get the JDBC driver, they'll get one 5 years ago and never touch it, and that could be trouble over time because they never update the driver. Or conversely, they could come along and use the most latest recent one, and something doesn't work right because there was something new and different in the recent ones, and it hasn't really been in the community long enough for people to say, hey, don't do that. And one in particular was it 8032 or 8027, one of those MySQL versions of about 3 years ago. The driver changed the way date times got returned from the database to any JDBC driver client. And Cold Fusion is a client talking to MySQL over this JDBC driver. And everybody said, oh, Adobe, you screwed up. My things are breaking left and right. It's like, no. This wasn't Adobe. It was the driver out of the blue changed to, instead of returning a simple date as a string, date and time as a string, it returned it as an object. Yay, objects are awesome, but if CF didn't know it was coming to it as an object, everybody's code that tried to use dates was failing, dates and times. So again, this is very specific to MySQL, very specific to that driver. And for about a year or two, everybody said, don't go to the driver above whatever the number was. And then eventually Adobe solved that problem with a recent update to CF. I think it was back in October. And now that problem is no longer a problem because CF does intelligently handle, if it's an object, it converts it back to a string for our use in our CF code. But anyway, there's much more I could say, but I see Nick said something else.
Yeah, I would say with that too, particularly for Lucy users, every time that they get a new version of Lucy, it tries to do auto updates. And
There you
there's
go.
been a string of MySQL Community Edition JDBC drivers talking specifically to older versions of MySQL, version 5, that type of stuff. So if you don't upgrade your database,
Yes.
causes a bunch of slowness. And then, or if you're talking to MariaDB in compatibility mode, I've been running across that quite a bit too.
Now help me out, because I'm always trying to be accurate, and you said Maria, so I've not heard that discussion. Is it really pronounced Maria, not Maria?
I've only heard it called MariaDB, but I might be wrong as well. So
Right, no, but you may be hearing from the right people. So that's, it's one of those things. I'm sure some of you know this. There are people that to this day call the web server that's not Apache and that's not IIS Nginx. Like, no, it's not Nginx. It's Nginx. And it's on their website. So I always point people who want to debate that point. I say, no, they tell you it's Nginx. And of course, then there's Azure, and nobody, Microsoft, even different people say Azure and different people say Azure. I think they've given up, call it whatever you want to call it. But anyway, thank you for that. I'll try to remember Maria, right? Did I say that right?
Yeah, like I said, that's what I've heard from some.
That makes
folks,
sense.
So.
That way, it's probably European, German, maybe, and they probably say Maria as Maria. Thank you for that. And then you said you touched briefly on tracking down deadlock errors after identifying the inquiries. Yeah, exactly. What would the next steps be to try and resolve the issue? Well, let me just say, I've been focused more on performance problems, and deadlocks usually present themselves pretty quickly, so they're not really performance problems, but it's a good thing to bring up because sometimes it could hang before it would tell you there's a deadlock. And let me just say, I didn't focus on it much because usually the database driver will present to you the information that the database told it, where it'll tell you that the query you're running was killed because it was in a deadlock contention, but it'll tell you like the, process ID or the SPID or something of the thing it was contending with. Now, sometimes if you dig into the logs, you'll find a little more information, but often you won't. And then you're right, it's hard to track down that problem. Now, I didn't get into this subject because it wasn't really about performance, but actually I should mention it because it's kind of tangentially related. Again, just for a moment, talking to SQL Server people. And then I'll tell you why, for example, this doesn't happen to Postgres people. SQL Server has forever been a pessimistic lock approach to doing things. So it introduces contention to protect the integrity of the data, and therefore it tends to block things because it's trying to say, hey, you're trying to do something, or somebody else is trying to do something, you two might step on each other. And that some of you know that can be addressed with the with no lock, clause on the SQL statement, but that's bad because now you're introducing this, low-level geeky thing into your code, and somebody someday will say, take that out of there, and how do you find all the places that you used it? And it isn't always as simple as just doing a search. Anyway, there's other solutions to that problem, and one of them is CF transaction. You can set the isolation level, but that's too much for some people. I want to throw out one that's a surprising solution for some people, and it's in SQL Server in particular, and it's called RCSI, for Read Committed Snapshot Isolation, RCSI. And it was added a few years ago, and at first it was kind of dodgy, and over the couple of releases since, it's gotten better. And that can be a huge improvement in the contention problem without, for many people, any cost, insofar as, no change to your code required, no detrimental negative impact on the integrity of your data. You just get the benefit of this now different kind of locking. And I'll say optimistic. I may have them backwards, which one's optimistic, which one's pessimistic. If anybody knows, feel free to speak up. But the point is, SQL Server always tended to introduce locking contention in an effort to protect you. And other databases do the opposite. They are out of the box optimistic, and they let things happen, and they figure you'll sort out if there's a problem or they try to do their best to protect you. Like I said, the RCSI tries to help protect you by the way it works. And I'm not saying that that's built into the way other database versions work, but my point is you should look into it. To your question of how do you track it down, I'm saying sometimes the right answer is, hey, maybe it's time to revisit. Is there something about the way our database is configured that we could change? And I know that's like, getting a kidney transplant. And some people are like, oh, I'm not going to do that until they're absolutely at the last stage. But it's sometimes what you need to do to solve the problem. And Nick, you asked the question, was there anything in particular you would have said on recommendation? Because I know you've been doing this sort of stuff for years too. Anything you would recommend to people for tracking down deadlocking?
Yeah, no, just more of
it was
basically
Lou.
what you
right. Nick, wrong Nick.
Yeah,
Nick, I didn't know that. I wasn't even looking at the last name. I was looking at the first name. My bad. Do you go by Nicholas or Nick?
Either one. Up for Nicholas.
I suppose here we should
doesn't
say
matter.
Nicholas to keep them separate.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I've just ran through a lot of the tools that you've mentioned, but you have mentioned a few that I hadn't used before. So that's really going to help track it down. A couple of things I've run into are like corrupted indexing on a database that would cause more deadlocks than it should.
Wow.
And that happened after we moved from an older database to a newer database and just moved the database over. The corruption came during the transfer, I guess, and then rebuilding the index did resolve that problem. But it took a while to track down the fact that it was corrupted to begin with. So that's kind of what I was looking for. That's why I asked the question is there another set of tools or direction that you would go to try and narrow in or hone in on what is causing them?
Well,
not so much the solution, but like SQL
Server.
Yeah.
Right. Well, then I want to remind you, and that's one of the reasons why I pointed it out, and I just don't want us to forget about it, that reports stuff in the Management Studio, one of the reports is about blocking and blocked transactions. You just literally right-click on it and say standard reports, standard reports, blocking transactions report. And it tells you who's blocking who and who's blocked by who. Now that's in the moment and recently, so it doesn't help if it was hours ago. I get that. Oh, by the way, I know that database health, and I want to point this out. I mentioned that database health tool, database health monitor at databasehealth.com by this guy, Steve Stedman. It's only for SQL Server. He does also a strong effort to track historically blocking transactions. So that's another one I would recommend for your specific SQL Server need. Go check that out.
All right. Thank you so much.
And then I haven't read everything, but I see that Randy shared that Brent Ozar has a tool for deadlock detection and correction. Yep. So I don't remember that off the top of my head, but thank you for reminding us that that's there.
I also got a question from Jade.
Right. I was going back up and
Okay.
I see Any. Is that who you say is Jade? Oh, sorry. Where's the name? I don't see a name, but is that any tools, techniques, strategies for identifying statistics issues? Yeah. It's weird. For some reason, I don't. Oh, I think my mouse is right over. Oh, sorry. My mouse was over. I was trying to make it wider and I moused over the thing that popped up icons. Anyway, yeah, Jade, sorry about that. For identifying statistical issues. Well, again, in general, no. Specifically, yes. Again, with respect particularly to SQL Server. Let me show you real quick in my browser. If I just say, my last name and SQL Server statistics. So I just said my last name, SQL Server statistics, and I go to Google by default. You go to wherever you prefer. Well, anyway, first, I've got this blog post on Understanding SQL Server Statistics, a great free book. And that's a discussion of this. That's that 40-page book. And I know it says 2015, but it's still there and it's still good. This stuff hasn't really changed by and large. Then I have this blog post called Tending the SQL Server Garden, which again I did in 2016. But I highlighted several of the things that I've talked about in various posts over the years. And I just want to answer your question by showing, check this out. the second bullet point, showing outdated SQL Server statistics. So there was a blog post, and by the way, this SQL Authority, and for you guys that are into SQL Server, you've heard of SQL Authority blog, perhaps. Pinal, P-I-N-A-L, Pinal Dave is his name. He's a former CF guy who many years ago moved to SQL Server, and he's going gangbusters, thousands of blog posts in the SQL Server world since then. Well, anyway, he had a blog post from a gent named Stuart Ainsworth, and I know him from Atlanta when I used to live down there. Anyway, I'm going to click on the link and show you his Pinal's blog post where he had Stuart as a guest blog post. And Stuart talked about the subject of statistics and them being out of date. And then this chunk of code, which is not that big, it's about 50 lines of code. I'm going to just hold this to go down. That's not going to work. I'll just do that. Yeah, it's about 50 lines of code. And so check this out, Jade. You just get the code, open up SQL Server Management Studio, run it. As long as you have the authority to see all your databases, it will just run against all your databases and produce this report. Now, this is a little small. I apologize. Can't really make the image too much bigger. But what it does is it shows, and it just says, DB1, DB2, whatever your database names are. Check this out. For each database, it'll tell you what are the oldest statistics in that database, what are the newest statistics in that database, what percentage of them were updated in the last day, and which ones do have auto-update stats and auto-updates async on. Well, I'm just saying, I've been using this, for 8 years now since I found it, and frequently I'll run this on people's machine. It just takes a couple seconds to run. It's nothing. It's nothing to think about. Just run it. As long as you have the authority to do what it says to do, it runs and it gives you this report. And that's where I've seen sometimes people have had 4- and 5-year-old statistics. Now, he's trying to make it produce a quick result in just a couple seconds. It's not telling you what tables in the database and what indexes and what tables. You have to do a little digging into that to find that yourself. And then when it comes to actually keeping the statistics up to date, he points out, and I point out on my website and in my blog post on Tending the SQL Garden, there's this gentleman named Ola Hallengren, and he's got open source SQL Server database maintenance scripts, among which is the ability to tell it to update statistics and to schedule it to do once a month or once a week, or do these databases this week and those databases that week. Anyway, that's a whole world of opportunity. But anyway, that's a quick and simple tool to at least tell you, is there potentially a problem? And I'm telling you, almost every time I look into it, there's some really way out of date statistics.
And I think Jade's question was specifically about Oracle.
No, I didn't get that. Oh, I see at the end the percents. Oh yeah, parentheses Oracle. Yeah, sorry. But anyway, I'm glad I said this because it's of value to people that do use SQL Server. You'll notice I did ask that of Nicholas. Sorry, I didn't even notice that with you, Jade. Oracle, I don't know. It's its own world. Oracle is literally its own world. People who do that sort of stuff with Oracle, that's all they do all day, every day. And I'm not one of them. I don't know the answer there. I'm sorry. But I would hope you could find something similar for sure. Thanks. And my condolences on having to work with Oracle. But you don't get to pick your database. Somebody else did, I'm sure.
Randy, do you know any Oracle experts on campus you could refer Jade to? I'm pretty sure you do. There's somebody
I think Jade works with all the Oracle database engineers on campus. So
right.
Yeah, we're also mostly Oracle Spatial, and so I'm finding that we are probably the Oracle Spatial experts on campus, but always looking for new tools, techniques, resources to help in our everyday troubleshooting and maintenance. So I appreciate it.
You bet. Glad to help. Anything else from anybody?
Well, I know it's a good topic, Charlie, because that's more questions than average from this group. So,
well, thank you. And, I'll just say, it's about the topic, not me. I understand that that's why I wanted to do this talk, is that I remember my first question was, have you had database problems? Of course you have. Everybody does. And sadly, so many of us, either we've worked for years with the things we work with and we don't keep up with what's new and different, or we work with people who are in that situation and they may even be the ones responsible for managing our databases. And you might think, well, certainly they know about all these things I've talked about. No, because I'm so often brought into situations where the CF or Lucy team folks are having these troubles, and I try to get them to have access to this information, and sometimes they'll be told, nope, we won't give you that access, which is terrible. Or they get us in touch with the DBA people, and we'll ask for some of these simple things, and they'll go, no, we don't have those, or no, we won't give you that information. It's like, how are we supposed to solve the problem? It's like Battleship. Some of you will not remember, Battleship was a game where it's kind of like two people sitting with a laptop in front of them, but each one can only see their screen, not the other one. And you're telling them where to place, things to blow up their battleship. And that feels like that sometimes when we're doing this sort of work, because the people on the other side won't give us what we need, and they expect us to just be able to figure it out. I'm just stressing it's so all the work that I do. And again, some of you might think, come on, this is just, of course, and everybody knows this, but no, the first step to solving the problem is getting the diagnostics to tell you what the problem is. We often so frequently fall into the trap of, I got problem X, I Google it, and somebody says, try this, try that, turn on this, turn off that, switch this, change that. It's like, no, wait, stop. Make sure first you know what the problem is. If you get the right diagnostic tools and know what the problem is, you might realize, holy smokes, that was taking me down where I was going was the wrong road. I need to go down this road instead. I just want to stress, from the CF side to the database side, and, server monitoring and everything in between, network monitoring, database monitoring, disk monitoring. You got to be able to keep an eye on these big picture things, because sometimes you will be pursuing something that's exactly not the right problem. I'll just remind you that one little story I shared is that it happens at least a few times a year where we pursue all these diagnostics. We follow all these obvious tracks. And in just a couple of hours, that's usually all it should take when you have the right tools to narrow down, here's the problem. I mean, I'm not lying when I say usually in a couple of hours, I can solve almost most problems you bring me, because if you have the right tools, you can easily find the solution. But so often, like a few times a year, we'll go through everything that reasonably presents itself and go, it's just nothing solving it. And I'll at that point, I'll say, this is on a VM. And they go, yeah. Well, let's talk about that, because sometimes the VM is managed by somebody you don't even know, and all you know is they gave you the VM. And I'll have this discussion, and it's just like the database and DBA discussion. Sometimes you won't get any good information from the VM people, but I'll just say, well, listen, how about you follow up with them and just explain you're having this problem? And it just feels from various things like the problem is with the VM and the host, something. And just not more than a couple sentences, throw it over the wall and see what they say. And I'm just telling you, most of the time, they came back to whoever asked the question and said, okay, try it now. And all of a sudden everything's better. And they don't often explain it, but what they did is sometimes they have just moved the VM from the host where it was in contention with some other bad, neighbor. It was like, you're in a apartment building with a bunch of, kids having fraternity parties. Like, that's not what I was signed up for. Get me out of this apartment building to a quiet apartment building. And they sometimes realize that, and maybe it was unexpected, maybe they weren't paying attention, but now that you bring it to their attention, they look and go, holy smokes, you're right. There's another couple machines on this host that are just blowing everybody else up. And they'll either move them and you're back to quiet land, or they'll move you because you're the greasy wheel that gets the grease. Anyway, give it a try. Sometimes that's the solution. I'm just saying there's not any obvious solutions to problems. There's just different solutions. And depending on the problem, once you know the real problem, you can really find the right solution. So it is a topic about which all of us have faced, and sometimes it will be some of these things we discussed. I hope it'll allow you to go get problems solved. I see if you don't have database problems, you have a static site. Yep, there you go. And some people would argue that's a way to solve the problem, is go towards more static site generation tools. And if everyone knows these things, they never had issues in their journey. There you go. And these are, hard lessons learned. And the point is, some of us learn them enough times to see them differently than what a lot of people offer as the answer. Like, you'll ask the question and get a lot of answers, but some of them are very facile. And when you dig a little bit, you realize, holy smokes, no, that's not the right solution. So some of you who know on the forums and other just community threads, sometimes I'll jump in with an answer and it goes on for 5 or 6 paragraphs because I'm trying to give the context to make sure that something wasn't overlooked and that somebody doesn't misinterpret what I'm saying. Because I find a lot of simple 1-sentence answers and 1-paragraph answers, I can just see the confusion that's going to arise, and I just can't help but want to speak up and say, wait, need to know a little bit more. Don't forget about this. Don't forget to consider that.
I think it's useful sometimes to see who's on your server, because I know of cases where departments and large organizations bought a dedicated database server, start having problems, and then they find out that some other people in the organization are riding rent-free on their database server.
Yep. Absolutely. And that I hinted at that with a couple of things I talked about back earlier, but thanks for bringing it up again. Sure, it's a different facet of the noisy neighbor thing, but yes, within the server, you might have other processes you're not expecting or other database users on the machine that are clobbering you, because it is one database server and it's serving everybody and it tries to do it effectively. That's good. And I didn't even think to make that specific point. There could be people on the server doing things that have nothing to do with you, and they're contributing to trouble on the server. Yeah, it may not be contention in the true sense of, locking and deadlocking, but it's because that's just specific to the particular database table. But they could be, back to what I said earlier, they're causing it to use more CPU, or, I could keep going further. TempDB and SQL Server or the equivalent in other database servers can be overwhelmed by people running, poorly crafted queries that are not using indexes and fill up TempDB. And then some people talk about, that's why you should create multiple TempDB files or go to more advanced versions of the SQL Server that solve that problem in different ways. Well, again, we weren't looking to solve every problem with all the ways it can be solved, but just to say, as you just said, just think of the big picture. Could it be that there's something else running on the machine or on the database server that's contributing to your trouble? And that's why I just can't stress enough, having a tool that tells you what's going on is the beginning of solving the problem. You might see, wait, what's that? Who are those people? And you may not have the authority to get that information, but somebody in a position of responsibility should be able to. And you might presume, well, they know what's going on. No, sometimes they don't. You got to bring it to their attention and press the points. All right. Anything else?
I think that's all of them.
Seems so. Well, cool. It's been a pleasure being back with you guys, as always. I look forward to any other time in the future. Got lots of talks I'm doing that you might want to have in the future. Just let me know. Always enjoy the opportunity to present them.